You think that in a year she's going to be out of a job. Why?
Well, I mean, I think the revolving door is spinning once again in Tokyo. I think because of Prime Minister Abe, who was around for almost 8 years, and Prime Minister Kishida, who was around for 3 years, we have this view that Japanese prime ministers tend to last a while. Not really. When you look at the extent to which Japanese prime ministers, they get about 12 months on average in office. And I think at the moment, Japan's in a moment of flux in many ways in terms of the global economy, in terms of local politics. And I think that, the LDP in many ways chose Takaichi because of the Trump of it all, right? I think they felt that she was probably the best option to face off with Trump at this very tense moment between Trump and the rest of the world. And I'm not quite sure that she'll have the stuff to remain in office 12 months from now. I mean, I could be very wrong about that. You could have me on in a year and you can laugh at me, and that's fine. But I do think the revolving door is spinning again once in Tokyo. And it's not her so much. It's just that the LDP is having an identity crisis. I think they're trying to basically hold on to power in any way that they can. And they'll do this in 12-month increments. And I think that that's what we're seeing at the moment in Japan.
Well, if there's one thing that I can think of that would mean she gets the boot in 12 months' time, if not earlier, it's the biggest issue facing Japanese politicians, including herself and the public, which is inflation. If she cannot manage to get inflation down sufficiently, that's probably going to be a cause to lose her job. What do you think? I mean, is that going to be the trigger? Is that what brings her down?
Yeah, and I think we can already guess that she won't bring inflation down, because if she's going to double down on Abenomics of the past, which means a sharply weaker yen, which means more government spending, that arguably means more inflation. And one of the problems that Japan is having at the moment certainly is that by exporting its way to faster economic growth, it's going to import more inflation. But Japan at the moment is trying to convince Japanese companies to give workers a raise, which is great. But Japan also has some of the lowest productivity in the OECD. We've seen nothing from any of the governments of the last 10, 15 years to increase productivity. So we're at a moment in Japan's economic cycle where any wage increases will be inflationary too. And so, when we talk about inflation will decide whether or not she has a job in 12 months, I think that fits with my thesis that 12 months is it for her.
Kari here. We've had these revolving door premierships in Japan many times in the past, but I think what's very different this time is that you're looking at minorities in both chambers of the Diet. I mean, even before we get to next year, in the very short run, how is she going to manage the relationship, one, with the coalition partner Komeito, and try to get the opposition on board in trying to get anything done? Do you think she will be successful, and how do you think she'll do that?
That's part of the problem, because, Takaichi is known for pretty sharp elbows. And at the moment when you're trying to build a governing coalition with opposition parties who want something, it'll be an interesting way forward. For example, a lot of the opposition parties, the price for their support is tax cuts. We've already seen that the bond market in Japan is not happy about that. Last month, we saw 20-year yields rise to the highest levels since 1999. That is a warning that the bond vigilantes are watching. And any effort to open up the fiscal floodgates, if you will, in ways that Takaichi has talked about, because she loves Abenomics, is going to unnerve the bond market. The stock market might be happy, but if Japanese government bond yields begin rising to 2% towards 3%, given Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of about 260%, that's going to be a very interesting battle between Tokyo and the bond vigilantes. And I think that that's one of the challenges that she's going to face when she deals with these opposition parties who all want lower taxes, starting with the consumption tax and then moving on to other taxes from there. And I think it will be a very interesting 12 months for the bond market here in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, she said things like, I don't rule out the option of a consumption tax hike after her victory. She said, look, I want to continue the gasoline tax cuts. I want to give more money to some of the smaller companies that are struggling and not making profits. So, she's starting to revert back to some of the original policies that she toned down during this election campaign. But I want to bring the BOJ in here. I mean, technically, they're supposed to be neutral, and it okay, they need to get to know each other, so to speak. But do you think the Bank of Japan will step over that and and heighten at a time when for years now inflation has been trending above the 2% line?
Well, I think regardless, I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I think regardless of who becomes prime minister next, the BOJ is on hold until further notice. I think when you look at the state of the global economy, when you look at the state of Japan's economy, when you look at the fact that unemployment in Japan, for example, is the highest in over a year at this point, pre-tariffs. This is probably not an environment where the Bank of Japan will have a lot of latitude to raise interest rates. I know that BOJ is making noises in that direction. I know that Governor Ueda continues to talk about how the tightening cycle is basically progressing. But at a moment when bond investors worry that the government will be, opening up the fiscal floodgates again, this is probably a very precarious moment for the BOJ to be raising rates. I think Japan could do with higher interest rates. I do. But will the Ueda BOJ have the courage to do what the Kuroda BOJ did not do and raise interest rates in a very difficult political environment? And we haven't talked about the Trump trade war angle of it all. I mean, is Trump done with his tariffs? Open question.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get onto the tariffs, but just a little bit more on the BOJ. I mean, before Takaichi's win, it seemed like the BOJ was testing the waters. I mean, last time they announced, surprisingly, the ETF sale, and the equity market barely blinked.
Right.
There's a meeting at the end of the month, no meeting in November, and there's one in December. Even if they hold off until January, with prices the way they are, I mean, they risk being behind the curve, no?
They do. I mean, you can argue that they're behind the curve as it is. But I think that the pivot to ETFs is also telling. The BOJ has been tapering bonds. That's really the big issue, right? That the extent to which in 2018, the BOJ's balance sheet became bigger than the entire economy, which is a first for a G7 economy. They've been tapering from the bond market. They've seen that the bond market doesn't like it. And so in some ways, they've kind of throttled back on quantitative tightening, if you will. They pivoted to the stock market. I think that was very telling, because the real issue is getting the BOJ out of the bond market, because we have entire days in Japan when not a single security trades because the BOJ is bigfooting the rest of the market. And that's just not a very healthy environment when you think about corporations needing to raise money. And so in many ways, the fact that they're pivoting to ETFs, to me, suggests they're going for the low-hanging fruit as opposed to doing the really hard work of withdrawing from the bond market.
William, I want to pivot the conversation to what's going on within the ruling party. You said at the top, you described it as an identity crisis for the LDP here. What does Takaichi's win mean for the party and for Japan's domestic politics going forward? Is it really just reacting to this rise of right-wing groups and conservatives in Japan? And how does that really position Japan going forward, perhaps with countries like the U.S., China, and South Korea?
I mean, you mentioned right-wing groups. You have the rise of this sort of Japanese MAGA party, if you will, the Sansaito party. And I think that in many ways has been a wake-up call for the BOJ. They're realizing that there is a bit of a nativist trend that's returning to Japanese politics at the moment. I think a lot of it has to do with, wage insecurity. I think a lot of Japanese households are looking at the extent to which the stock market is reaching records. The fact that we continue to have leaders, come and go who talk about raising wages, and they don't really succeed in doing that. And at a moment when inflation in many ways is rising faster than average wages, the average Japanese worker, the average Japanese household is not wildly optimistic. And then you have, Generation Z. They're looking at a future where their economic prospects are a lot gloomier than that of their parents. And so there's a lot of kind of, currents, if you will, that mirror the MAGA party in the U.S. And I think that's something that, the LDP is looking at, and they're wondering, how do we tap into that anger without losing our overall policy framework? And I think Takaichi will be facing that challenge. And I think it'll be an interesting question as to whether she'll be able to thread that needle, if you will.
And I wonder if how much room there is for some kind of a surprise here. I mean, you know, this could be a question that applies to her monetary policy, economic policy, but as well as a foreign policy risks here, because the headline is, yes, she's a hardline conservative, but it could actually mean something different in 2025, as you pointed out, with the trade war, with the Trump administration, and how things are really evolving with countries like South Korea. I mean, the South Korean, new president is really known for his pragmatic approach. Maybe she wants to be a pragmatic leader because things are very different in 2025.
That's possible. I mean, we could discuss this question for a couple of hours. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, one of the wild cards for me, is that Takaichi recently in an interview or speech talked about renegotiating the U.S. trade deal. That could have been just a moment of her speaking, sort of off the cuff from the hip. And we'll see if she actually puts meat on those bones. But if she does look at the U.S. and she does say to President Trump at their first meeting, I think there's scope to renegotiate the U.S. trade deal. That will be fascinating. The other question, as you mentioned, one of the most interesting parts of the Ishiba legacy was that you did see South Korea and China and Japan speaking in ways we haven't seen in years. Will that détente now die a very, very sudden death? We'll see. I mean, I think the Yasukuni of this all, the question is also something we should be discussing. If we do see Takaichi going to Yasukuni Shrine anytime soon and on something of a regular basis, I think we could see all bets off between this détente between Japan, South Korea, and China. Or will economic considerations overcome, those hard feelings? It's a very open question, but it'll be interesting to see how she and Trump get along. That to me is the wild card.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have a flavor of that when, the two are likely to meet at the end of the month. I mean, in terms of defense spending and that sort of thing, they're likely to see eye to eye. But I do want to get back to your comments about renegotiating the U.S. agreement. I mean, she came out of the news conference, well aware that those comments ruffled feathers, saying that, look, what we agreed to is what we agreed to. I'm going to stick to it. But she did add to that if there are things that are not in the national interest, I'm going to state my case. And I think it's all, I mean, at this point, I think people are worried about this $550 million US dollar pledge, right? It's all very well that, it's all very well that leaders use this kind of thing to their advantage. But what does it mean for corporate Japan? They've been in limbo for months now, and they don't know where to put their investments. And what does it mean for corporate profitability and corporate investments going forward?
Well, they're not going to know where to put their investments for another 6 months, right? Because, one of the interesting things is $550 billion, signing bonus that Trump is demanding from Japan. This is equivalent to Ireland's annual GDP. And I think that Prime Minister Ishiba, I really do believe that he agreed to this $550 billion figure because he assumed it wouldn't happen, right? Because the U.S. is saying, we want the money tomorrow in cash, like, some mafia deal. And Japan is saying, well, we'll do it in grants, we'll do it in loans, we'll do it over time, we'll do it through our quasi-government agencies, we'll do this over the next 5 to 10 years, maybe. The U.S. is looking for cash up front. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how Takaichi handles this. And I think one of the added wrinkles is that South Korea in the last week, the last 10 days, has essentially said to the U.S., we're not paying, the $350 billion the U.S. is demanding from South Korea. We can't do it. It would be equivalent to, or it could trigger another financial crisis for us. Forget it. Will that give Takaichi scope to say to the U.S., look, the 15% tariff sounds fine, but $550 billion without anything really in return is a bit much for us. And we're a new government and we have different ideas. And frankly, there's nothing signed on paper, right? I mean, the U.S.-Japan trade deal is kind of a handshake deal between a couple of leaders. There is scope for Takaichi to come in and say to Trump, I don't think so. And again, maybe she won't, because her mentor, Shinzo Abe, wasn't as strong towards the U.S. as I think many people like to think. People said, oh, he's a Trump whisperer. But he really, I would argue, he was very enabling and weak towards Trump. He basically flattered him. He nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize and got very little in return. Will Takaichi follow that same model where she says, yes, sir, and she bends the knee, or will she be a stronger leader? And I think we have no idea how that's going to play out. And if you're a corporate CEO in Japan, you're thinking about the next 6 to 12 months, you have no idea what to be thinking about U.S.-Japanese relations.